colleague Patrick Meyer, who was one of the leaders of digital humanitarian community, and he was the one who developed the first crowdsourcing map in response to earthquake in Haiti in 2010 on January 12th, and also wrote a book about digital humanitarians. And on his Twitter, he actually asked a question about why are we not seeing a major crowdsourced response from digital humanitarians. And as a reference to this type of response, he actually included the screenshot of the Russian fires help map that was launched 10 years ago. So I actually started thinking about to what extent the experience of what we did 10 years ago from conceptual point of view can help us to think about the current situation. And the second thing actually was also some kind of coincidence that just a couple of weeks ago, a book chapter that I contributed to a very interesting collection that was edited by Sergei Davidov from Higher School of Economics, Internet in Russia, was published. And this book chapter that I contributed, TrueNet in Crisis Situations, actually tried to provide some kind of conceptual framework to the analysis of the role of information technologies, and specifically the role of Russian internet in the context of different type of emergency situations. And it seems that the conceptual framework that I used to analyze different type of crisis situations in Russia is quite useful in order to contribute to our reflexivity about ongoing situation right now. And this conceptual framework includes a number of key elements that I would like to apply today as a part of the analysis of the current situation. So actually, the presentation today is going to be structured and built of two parts. So first, briefly, I'm going to discuss actually the events that took place 10 years ago around Russian wildfires, and then I'm going to move to the situation nowadays around COVID-19 and try to use some conceptual framework and some theories that I used to analyze what happened 10 years ago in order to discuss what's going on right now. But let me first briefly to say what is included in this chapter and in this conceptual framework. First of all, I'm looking into the interrelation between the digital crowds and digital sourcing. And what I'm trying to argue that the internet kind of helps to emergence of a new type of social system in a situation of emergency, which offers a different type of roles and a different type of opportunities of engagement in regard to crisis situation. And that includes a number of elements, including a collection of data about the crisis and coordination of mutual aid and mobilization of people's resources in response to this crisis situation. Just extremely briefly, I would like to clarify what I mean by crowdsourcing, because there are hundreds of different type of definitions of what crowdsourcing is about. So crowdsourcing is kind of divided into two elements. First one is about crowd, and the second one is about sourcing. So the crowd is the group of people that use digital platforms, and they are able to share their resources in order to address some kind of aspects of crisis situation. And the sourcing is actually related to different type of resources that can be mobilized in response to crisis situation. And we can see a lot of different type of resources if it's about analytical resources of people that are able to analyze something, if it's about intellectual resources, if it's about financial resources. And just to summarize, so in the case of crowdsourcing, in the case of crisis-related crowdsourcing is a digitally mediated mobilization of resources of the users around crisis-related goals. And we are going to see how it was used in the context of wildfires and what's different nowadays around COVID-19. So when I discussed the role of internet, and particularly the role of Russian internet around wildfires in 2010, I could identify some kind of triangle of relationships, because we have digital users, the citizens of Russia in this case, we have the state institutions, and we have the crisis situations. And we have a number of different sets of relationships. One is between people and crisis, another one is between the institutions and crisis, And finally, also the relationship between state and citizens in the context of crisis. And what we can see that the Russian internet and digital platforms in general play a very substantial role in changing the structure of these relations. And we can actually identify three different functions. The first one is about using information technology just to inform people about what's going on, if it's about some kind of crisis situation. Second one is about alerting people. So this is more than just informing, because this is some specific information that shares some kind of instructions with people about what they need to do in order to protect their lives in the context of specific crisis situation. And finally, engagement, which is about engagement, digitally mediated engagement of people in response to crisis situation, relying on mobilization of different resources of these people that are kind of enabled by information technologies. So what we can see in the case of Russian wildfires, that there was some kind of very significant scale of mistrust between citizens and the traditional institutions, and many people shared online the feeling that actually state fails to provide an adequate response to this emergency situation. The state is not able to manage the fires, and therefore there is a need to actually self-mobilize in response to this type of situation, because only citizens are able to provide some kind of adequate response. And this is really important because in this case, the internet on the one hand contributes to the capacity of people to share their frustration about the state, and at the same time, the same tools allow people to self-mobilize in order to address this crisis situation. And this is where actually the health map that was mentioned by Patrick Meyer came into the picture, because that was one of the first crowdsourcing platforms that allowed to facilitate mutual aid between people, and it allowed to connect those people who needed some kind of help with those who are able to share different type of resources, and that can be also addressed as some kind of allocation of resources tool, because some people have something, some other people need something, but there is a need to provide some kind of efficient system of the management of these resources. And what is really interesting that in this case, this management was enabled not by a specific organization, but by the digital platform. And this type of crowdsourcing platform, in this case, it was based on a technology that was called Ushahidi, is something that also reminds us about the notion of connective action by Lance Bennett and Alexandra Segerberg, that highlights that because of the information technologies, we are able to manifest some forms of collective action without a need of having a common organizational affiliation. So in this case, all the agent that allowed this kind of collaboration between people was the map, was the online platform, and not organizational affiliation. And if we look really into the functions of this map, so it addressed the specific needs of this crisis. So the symbol of the needs of the wildfires in 2010 was fire hoses, because the state actors were not able to provide enough professional equipment to address the fire. So people were able actually to fundraise, people were able to use their own money and to buy the specific fire hoses that were required to address the fire. And then also some volunteers took these fire hoses and they went to the field and used it in order to address the fire. So every crisis situation has its own specific needs. And generally the basic assumption was that the state's supposed to provide this type of equipment, but actually that was not the real situation in this particular case. We also can see similar type of situations when some specific equipment or some specific resources that traditionally states supposed to provide it are missing, and people substitute it by their own efforts based on crowdsourcing. So if we use another type of crisis situation, which is much more recent, which is the war in Ukraine, we could see also that some kind of night vision equipment for participating in warfare, or drones or different type of equipment was not provided by traditional military. So people again used different type of online platforms, crowdfunding platforms, and other type of platforms in order to buy this equipment and provide this equipment to volunteers that participate in warfare. So here the main point is that actually every crisis has its own properties that are related to the central things that are missing, that the things that are resources that's supposed to be provided by traditional institutions, but these resources are missing. So here already you may recognize that I'm kind of leading to the current crisis, and we are going to discuss what are the current fire hoses and what are the current night vision tools that are missing in the context of current crisis, and what's the role of crowdsourcing in this context. But before moving to the current crisis, let me just finish a couple of very important insights that we can take from the wildfires in 2010, and this is kind of summary. So the summary of the role of the platforms in case of wildfires was that, first of all, the platforms contribute to transparency around crisis because we have state actors that try to conceal a real scale of the disaster, and then crowdsourcing allows to mobilize the sensors of people in order to actually collect information about what's going on. Then, based on this collection of data, people are able to try to hold the state accountable and say that the state is not able to address some key aspects of what's going on. And then, if the state is not able to provide the proper response to crisis situation, so we also can see a lot of different type of self-mobilization relying on crowdsourcing when people mobilize in order to address the crisis. But what we also can see is a very interesting type of tension between accelerated innovation in order to address these needs and also accelerated development of new forms of control. And this is something that we can highlight by a comparison of two conceptual frameworks. One is a framework that's related to the notion of limited statehood, which argues that in the case of crisis, there is no enough state capacity to provide basic governance needs, and then the information technologies allow people to substitute lack of this capacity of the state. And on the other hand, we can see that the state tried to take the situation under control, and it's not only about crisis, but also about the people. And there is a very famous concept of state of exception by Agamben, which kind of highlights that the state tries to use the crisis situation to have some kind of suspension of traditional law and take the situation under control. And what we can see around the role of digital platforms is also the tension between the self-mobilization of people in response to crisis and the efforts of state to innovate in order actually to increase the scale of control over people and not only to address the crisis situation. And that's where I would like to make some concluding remarks about wildfires, because what we could see in case of wildfires was actually that some of the state-sponsored platforms for mobilization of volunteers were developed in order to not to engage people in a response to crisis situation, but actually in order to increase the scale of control over the volunteers. And for instance, here you can see a screenshot of the platform that was called dobrovolets.rf, which is the volunteer in Russian. And this platform actually was a platform that allowed people to register, but in order to participate in some kind of volunteering around different type of crisis situations. But actually the structure of this platform didn't allow people to see what kind of activities are offered for them in order to participate, and they were not able to decide how they can mobilize their resources. So actually this type of platform was mostly about controlling the resources of volunteers and not about engagement of these resources. So this is actually very interesting comparison of different type of architecture of platforms, the platforms that allow people to decide what they do, and the platform that actually launched by state actors in order to take the volunteers under control, but without really offering them real opportunities and without real transparency about what kind of activities are related to crisis that they can take part into as a part of crisis response. So just to conclude, what I'm trying to argue that we can see some kind of tension between traditional horizontal and vertical crowdsourcing. When vertical crowdsourcing is actually about how state actors try to create a semblance of openness and participation, but actually the major purpose of these platforms is not to engage people, but to control the resources of the crowd in the case of crisis situations. And here we actually come to the current crisis. And this is the other type of triangle, which is similar to the triangle that we could see around wildfires in 2010. But here we explore actually a different type of dynamics, which is about the role of digital innovation and digital mediation in the relationship between people and crisis, in this case, coronavirus, and also in relationship between citizens, digital users, and state actors, and how what is the role of the crowd and how the resources of the crowd are allocated around the current crisis, and what are the structures and what are the tools for management of volunteers around this crisis. So first of all, if we compare, and I found it's very interesting that if we look into the pictures from 10 years ago, and if we look around wildfires, and if we look into the pictures right now, there is some kind of visual similarity, because on the left you can see the images when the smoke was covering Moscow because of the fires, and people were wearing masks on the Red Square. And nowadays we also can see the similar type of pictures and similar type of visual images around people wearing masks on the Red Square, but due to a different type of reason. And what is important about wildfires in 2010 and about the current crisis is this: the scope of crisis is very big. So unlike some other crises that are quite local and people just participate remotely or go somewhere in order to help and to volunteer, here we can see that actually the crisis is almost everywhere. So in case of wildfires in 2010, western part of Russia was covered by smoke. In case of the current crisis is literally everywhere, and we're all kind of locked in our homes by this crisis. So we have some kind of unmediated relationship with crisis. It's not only about the internet that is between us and the crisis, but also we can see this crisis out of our own windows to some extent. And this is important because that kind of contributes to the power of the transition and to the power of the crisis-related system that is mediated not only relying on digital tools, but it's also embedded in the structure of our everyday life, even beyond the internet. Obviously, what we can see in Russia right now is that the state tries to send this image that everything is under control on the visual level, and there's some humor around it already, because we see some images that are produced by state to highlight that the leader is keeping the situation under control. What we also can see is a very interesting game around attribution of blame around the crisis, because what we can see that actually not the virus is held responsible for crisis, but some other international actors are held responsible. So on the one hand, the Western countries blame Russia for spreading disinformation around virus, and so Russia denies spreading U.S. conspiracy on social media. These are some headlines that you can see, and U.S. says Russia behind disinformation campaign around virus, and the same arguments we can see from the EU as well. On the other hand, Putin says that fake coronavirus news reports being sent to Russia to spread panic. So first of all, it's really interesting to follow this dynamic that every side tries to blame the other side in actually responsibility for this crisis, and try to kind of be beyond accountability in this particular case because others are responsible. But we also can see a very significant scope of innovation that kind of address the major 3 points that we could see also around Russian wildfires. First is about just informing people, and we can see a lot of different type of maps, dashboards that provide us with real-time information about the crisis. There is even the rating of the best maps. One of the most famous maps is the map that was produced by Johns Hopkins University, but there are dozens of other maps. What is really interesting, and in Russia, the Moscow authorities opened a dedicated channel on Telegram, and as you know, the Telegram is still considered to be banned in Russia because it doesn't follow the requirements from Russian security services and the Ministry of Communication. So it's quite interesting that actually the state authorities use the tools for risk communication that are considered to be prohibited officially at the same time. But this is only the first basic level of informing people about what's going on. The second level is all about alerting people. And here we see very interesting shift not only in Russia, but in different countries. Here I use some examples from Russia and from Israel, from trying to alert people based on very advanced technologies that allow you to see that there are some people with virus close to you based on tracking on their mobile phones. For instance, in Israel, there was an official app that was developed that called Magen, defense app that allows you to see if you were in some kind of proximity with people that potentially have the virus. And the government allowed to use technologies that usually used by only security services to track people with virus. But what also we can see in very recent days in Moscow, following the decision about lockdown in Moscow, is a new type of facial recognition technologies that are going to be used, and also development of QR code technology that actually every citizen, every person in Moscow is provided with a special QR code that kind of creates his or her identity in the context of crisis, and allow to authorities to follow this person and to decide if he is allowed or not to move outside despite despite the lockdown. So this is about the alerting aspect. But what is really interesting, and here I'm just very briefly using the same analogies that are familiar for people who study Russia, is the structure of the needs around resources. And here, this is the major thing that I'm going to conclude with it, because first of all, every crisis has its own so-called deficit. So on the left, you see the pictures from Soviet Union of empty shelves. Now we know that we are all in demand of sanitizers and some other toilet paper. So there's some key essential things that are missing. The second thing is that we also know from Russia and from Soviet Union is so-called очередь, the queue. And now a crisis is also followed with emergence of its own queues. Interestingly, it's not only offline queues, but also online queues. So for instance, here it's an image from Ocado, and the online queues include 45,000 people, which is quite amazing. So this is not a queue that you could imagine having it offline. You also can see a failure of the online delivery systems. If you are in UK, so probably you're familiar with these pictures that you are not able to get delivery anywhere because there is no enough resources to deliver products to people. And finally, you see some kind of efforts to manage the limited resources. In Russia and Soviet Union, you had so-called talony or карточки that you need to use to buy a limited amount of essential products. Now you're in UK, you are not able sometimes to buy unlimited amount of products if they're considered to be essential. If it's about offline or online, where also the number of products available also limited. And finally, the last thing that we know from crisis situations in the Soviet Union and also right now, that you have emergence of so-called speculanti, a black market of these missing products. And here you could see that some of the toilet paper was sold for £1,000 on eBay, and you have sanitizers that sold for £40 on eBay. And again, this is a kind of emergence of black market. So this is really highlights the idea that every type of crisis situation is associated with specific resources that considered to be limited or missing, and there is a need to manage these resources. And there are some digital platforms right now that try to map the shortage, and this is one of these maps of coronavirus shortage, and you can see that there are different places over Europe. The different goods are missing, and this is something that people use to map based on this virtual map. But the major resource that is currently missing, the kind of the symbolic fire hose of the current crisis, is obviously the ventilators and the masks that are required by medical personnel in order to save people's life, in order to protect themselves as well from the virus. And here, so we see that every crisis, as I mentioned, has its own missing resources that need to be addressed. And as a response, we see that the crowd, the digital crowd, mobilize in order to address the problem of missing resources. So first of all, we see the comeback of so-called makers that use 4D printers in order to develop the missing resources, and we have a lot of different type of initiatives in order to produce different type of ventilators or hospital valves or some kind of medical supplies that are missing because of the current crisis. So this is the first form of crowdsourcing. We also have dedicated platforms that try to kind of crowdfund masks or to collect different type of protective equipment from people. We see this kind of projects almost everywhere. So the mask match, the donate your PPE, get us PPE, and other type of platforms that either collect funding or collect actual equipment or produce equipment in order to address this type of missing resources, and a very broad scope of digitally mediated engagement of people in order to address different type of problems related to current crisis. So this is the first common thing that we can see, that every crisis has kind of missing resources that people online mobilize in order to address these resources. And we also have a very significant wave of online innovation. There are a lot of different type of hackathons that try to develop different type of application, different type of solutions in order to, again, use the innovation in order to address these major challenges related to the current crisis. But my final point is going to be about actually the question that was asked by Patrick Meyer in the beginning about the health maps. And actually there are some health maps, and I just tried to collect some screenshots. You have a platform that's called Corona Helpers that kind of tries to connect those who offer help and those who request help. You have a crowdsource rescue. You have coronabody.co.uk that connect communities in a time of need. But these health maps are not really efficient because if you kind of really follow, the number of people that use this type of tools is relatively limited. But what is really efficient and what is really becoming a symbol of the current crisis is actually relying on the hyper-local tools, mostly Facebook groups and WhatsApp chats, in order to actually organize community on extremely local level. So, for instance, you see a screenshot from a WhatsApp group that kind of people try to identify their area and their neighborhood. There is a dedicated platform that's called COVID-19 Mutual Aid UK that has about 5,000 different type of groups, and you're able to actually go and find your street and see what kind of groups link to your street. And people on these groups do a lot of different type of things. It's really unstructured because every group includes between 50 and 200 people. And if it's about just sharing that there are some goods that started to be available in a local grocery, or some people ask for help to buy something for them, etc., etc. So you see a lot of collaboration on extremely local level, which is quite interesting because this is a kind of allocation of resources that takes place on unstructured level, but because it's so local, so you don't have really need in the complicated platforms that divide everything into categories. You are just able to communicate with the people from your street or from your compound. At the same time, in Russia, you see also emergence of interesting stuff that kind of reminds us of what happened around health map. On the one hand, you have a state-sponsored platform which called Move Vmesте. It's based on a platform that's called Dobro.ru, kind.ru, which is kind of defined as a mutual aid platform in order to address coronavirus situation. But again, it really reminds us the dobrovolets.rf platform. You can just register there, and then you don't really know what's going on with you because you kind of contribute information about yourself to some kind of state-sponsored initiative, but you don't really know if anyone is going to come back to you. There is one initiative that kind of reminds, on the other hand, to us something that's going on right now in UK. It's called the Covidarnost. Unlike what's happening in UK, it's based on Telegram, and it's a Telegram bot chat where people can go and say that they live in specific street, and this chatbot potentially supposed to say that your street is covered by specific online group, if it's about based on WhatsApp or based on Facebook or based on some other type of platforms. The problem is that that's a very advanced and interesting tool, but if you really use it, you see that there are almost no WhatsApp and Facebook groups in Moscow or in other regions. So when you go actually and try to find some kind of groups, so there is a tool to find groups, but there are no groups. So unlike in UK, where you have 5, 6, 7,000 of groups right now, in Russia, it seems that this hyperlocality doesn't really work right now. So that's kind of a problem. That's kind of a gap that we can see in Russia. You can also ask a question if the recent initiative by NHS to kind of register with NHS as a volunteer is kind of more close to this idea of vertical crowdsourcing. Because actually what happens there, also people register with some kind of official organization, so it's not really connective action, it's mostly collective action that's supposed to be managed by some kind of administrators. And on the right side of the screen, you see what kind of messages people get when they register. So it says that we have a very high volume of inquiries. Actually, I think about 750,000 people registered already with this platform, and it will take us a few days to process it. So there is a problem of with any kind of vertical management of volunteers. The good thing about UK, so you can actually register with this type of initiatives, but you also can find your local group where you're not kind of depend on any type of administrator. So I mean, here we can see some kind of collaboration and some kind of synergy between a broad state-sponsored, NHS-sponsored initiatives on state level that are not so efficient at this point of time because they're not able to process all the data of people, and all this ecosystem of hyper-local groups that are actually working right now, and you don't need an administrator to manage it. Just a couple of concluding remarks. You can see some interesting platforms right now in Russia that start to be developed in order to respond to the crisis. So there is a platform that's called Готовый Kitchen, Ready Kitchen, that is kind of a sharing of the space of restaurants that have been closed in order to prepare food for people. You have some initiatives to save Russian business, mostly local and small business, and SME, small and medium business. You have some hackathons in Russia as well. You have some crowdfunding initiatives to buy protective equipment, but it seems that the horizontal element is still kind of missing. And if we see this kind of horizontal mobilization in UK, there is some kind of problem in Russia with this type of horizontal mobilization. Just a couple of concluding slides. What is also interesting and what you can see online as a part of the communication of people around crisis is a lot of different type of digitally mediated disconnection. And this is really interesting because the discussion of crisis, and if you follow different type of feeds on Facebook or other social media platforms, you see that it's kind of full of information about crisis. There is no any other topic almost that is covered by people. And these messages that I just collected, these are a number of examples. These are messages of people that say that they disconnected other friends because they say something about coronavirus, unfriended, so-called. So someone says that I unfriended one virus dissident and one virus panic person because I'm not able to follow them anymore because of what they write. Thank you to coronavirus. Now I know all the stupid people that I need to remove from my friends. I have removed 12 people from my feed. The coronavirus help us to see who is the real evil, etc., etc. So we see a lot of disconnection because of disagreement about responses to crisis situation. So we need to understand that it's not only about social isolation that we can see, it's also about social polarization that triggered by crisis situation. And this is also quite common to Russian internet, that any type of crisis kind of followed by this type of digitally mediated disconnection. On the other hand, and this is almost my last slide, one before the last, we also see the capacity of people that got the virus to communicate their experience. And this is extremely important because we see that state actors very often try to transform people with the virus to kind of objects that need to be contained and removed because they're dangerous. And this kind of dehumanization of people with virus is extremely dangerous in a situation of state of exception and state of emergency. So the capacity of people with virus to have some voice, the capacity of people to use Instagram to communicate about their experiences is extremely important because this contributes to this kind of humanization, and this doesn't allow to transform people from subjects to objects, and actually that support the opposite process from object to subject. And this is a kind of conclusion that I would like to say. I think that we need to think today about this kind of developments related to the role of information technologies, not only in the context of happening right now, but also in the context of what will happen after this crisis will end. And at some point, hopefully, it's going to end. And we can see this kind of balance between the development of technologies that contribute to social resilience, which is about the development of capacity, bottom-up capacity to address new challenges and technologies of control. And in some states, we see that this aspect of technologies of social resilience, which is all about mobilization of resources of people in order to address the crisis, these technologies are much stronger. In other states, we can see that the technologies of control are much more efficient. And here, if we compare UK and Russia, I think in UK we can see a lot of horizontal technologies and development of digital resilience and hyperlocal sourcing and community empowerment. In Russia, to this point, we see mostly new forms of control over crowd resources, and we see some kind of concerning developments like with face recognition and QR codes, which is all about the transformation of subjects into objects that need to be controlled. So I think that the question that we need to ask, what kind of societies we will have from the and what is the contribution of technologies following the end of this crisis, and if the technologies of control are going to be the ones that remain after this crisis, it's very concerning. If this crisis contributes to development of technologies of social resilience, obviously that will make the local community and society much stronger. So this is the balance that we need to follow. So that's the end of my presentation, and I can say that I really hope that you all stay safe, but first of all, let me also give you some space for questions, and back to Sam.
Thank you, Grisha. That was fascinating and thought-provoking, and it has already provoked some thoughts. I'm going to go straight to questions. Some people have nicknames up here on the chat, so I don't know what their actual names are, but somebody who goes by the name Alida has asked me to read out this question, which is, what differences are there in the challenges digital community organized initiatives, digital community organized initiatives face in Russia and the UK? And do you see any specific problems to each nation?
I think I tried to address this question. First of all, let me. Was I able to stop sharing the presentation, or you still can see the presentation?
The presentation is off the screen.
Off the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I tried actually to do this comparison, and I think that what we can see in case of UK is this really emergence of hyperlocality, which is extremely interesting. And if we know about this traditional argument of political science about the end of traditional community, about bowling alone, the very famous book by Putnam. So now we see the comeback of communities, because if you really follow some of these groups, and I'm trying to follow it on an everyday basis, you really see to what extent these groups are very flexible. They're able to address a very broad range of issues, and they're really able to manifest people mutual aid and also allocate these missing resources in the best way, because eventually mutual aid is all about facilitation of allocation of the resources in a situation of crisis, in a situation when some of those resources are missing. And the problem about Russia at this point of view, that at least from what I can see from here, we don't see these hyper-local initiatives. At the same time, there are no big projects like Health Map that we could see about 10 years ago that was quite symbolic to some extent for the idea that information technologies can facilitate health. Hopefully, the kind of mismatch between having the tools to find the groups and the lack of these groups will be addressed with the development of the current crisis in the next few days. But at the same time, it seems that there are some kind of social aspects of the Russian society at the current point of time, mostly related to trust, maybe, that doesn't really allow the manifestation of hyperlocality in the way it manifested in UK.
Interesting. Thank you for that on behalf of Alide. Sergey Samolenko, do you want to come in with your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Sergey Samolenko, working at George Mason University. Grisha, I have a question about the blame attribution research you mentioned. And could you elaborate more on the application of this research in the Russian context? So I know there is little done on attribution theory altogether by Russian scholars. And what appears interesting to me is that the whole overuse of this label paniqueur, which in fact, overlaps with a lot of research that I'm doing right now. We're doing research in climate change, attacks by think tanks on climate change researchers, and basically one of the main strategies used is accusation of alarmism, climate change alarmism, and it looks like actually it also plays the same way in the Russian context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's very important. It allows me actually to connect some parts of my presentation that maybe I wasn't able to make enough connection, which is about actually the role of a digital platform for mobilization of society in a situation when there is some kind of shared understanding the state is not really able to address the crisis situation. And then the state, if it's concerned about this type of self-mobilization, really tries to remove the basis of the solidarity by arguing that some people are panickers or some people are not really trustable and some people are part of the disinformation campaigns. So it seems that in the current situation, the blame-shifting technologies that kind of transform and shift the attention from the responsibility of state to other actors, or try to increase the scale of mistrust between people. And this is something that we can see in the case of digital disconnection, because once people really kind of start to disagree because someone is panicker and someone is actually alarmist and someone is actually state-sponsored, etc. So we can see actually that the crisis situation, it doesn't really create a basis of solidarity that allows self-mobilization in order to address the crisis, but creates this type of disconnection, which kind of leaves the space for a state to be the leading actor and also remove the pressure of accountability from the state. So I think that if we consider this type of dynamics around blame shifting and around framing different actors as responsible in the context of the opportunities of bottom-up mobilization of society, we can see that this is a technology that also can be used by state to control the crowds and to diminish the capacity of the crowd to self-mobilize in response to crisis.
Great. Got a question from Mark Berenson, our very own at the Russian Institute. Mark, do you want to unmute your microphone and ask the question?
Hello? Okay.
Hi.
Great presentation. This is fascinating stuff and very timely. I'm just curious, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, what happened to those volunteers who took part in fighting against the wildfires in 2010 in Russia? Were they more likely to get involved with other activities, either of a volunteering sort or of a anti-government sort? It seemed to be a unique event that sort of occurred. Obviously, it was a unique event for everyone in Moscow at the time when that happened. But in terms of getting folks to fight the fires on a voluntary basis was not something that was quite common, I would imagine, up until then.
Grisha,
Yeah.
before you answer that,
Yeah.
I wonder if I might just add a very closely related question, which is, do we know anything about who was more likely to participate in those, right? So both, Mark's question is about sort of what happened afterwards. Do we know anything about what happened before? Who was more likely to participate? And does any of that insight transfer to what we might expect in terms of volunteering or participation in a crisis like COVID-19?
So I don't think that, first of all, to Sam's question, I don't think that I'm familiar with any specific sociological research that explore the identity of the volunteers. And this is quite challenging also because due to unstructured nature of this participation. Because when we talk about connective action and when we talk about platforms like Health Map or some online communities on LiveJournal that was very popular at this period of time, it's really very difficult to follow the identity of all the participants. It seems that most of the people were tech-savvy people with some kind of resources, with some kind of digital literacy in order to use these tools. And what happened with these people is quite interesting question as well, because the nature of this type of connective action is that people are self-organized in response to a specific crisis situation. But once this crisis disappears, so most of these people come back to their everyday life. And they come back to the everyday system with the everyday roles that are not really related to Crisis. So there are a minority, a number of people that continue to be participating in charities or started to try to develop some kind of volunteer initiatives. But I think that the majority of people that participate in crisis response in this type of situations, they just come back to the everyday life once the situation is over. And this is the nature of this participation. What is also interesting, and we can see that actually the main contribution of wildfires was not only about participation of people, but was about development of digital innovation, because the crowdsourcing platforms that were used for response to wildfires were similar type of platforms were used also after it for political self-organization and for different type of environmental monitoring. So what is really interesting is the transition of innovation from the crisis-related field to the field of political activism and to field of urban activism. Because, for instance, the platform that was launched by Alexei Navalny, whom probably most of you know, just a few months after the wildfires, his first crowdsourcing platform that was focused on monitoring potholes on roads, was kind of inspired by HealthMap and was relying on the same kind of design and architecture of the platform. So here we could see that the methodology and the structure of the platforms kind of inspire the crisis-related platforms inspire other type of political and social innovation.
Great. Okay. Alida, you've got a second question, and I've sent you a text to ask if I can actually find out what your name is, because anonymity is great for certain things, but for seminar, it's nice to know who we're talking to. But the question is, how can we involve less technologically adept members of society? Right. So you mentioned in your answer now to both to my question and to Mark's question, Alida Naylor is the name. Sorry if I've mispronounced that, which is almost inevitable, but older generations may have these problems realizing these initiatives exist. You mentioned that one of the greatest sort of predictors of this, obviously, of participation is being savvy enough to use the tools, and the residue that remains also is a technological residue, right? So does that create sort of generational cohort effects and leave out certain sectors of the population?
Yeah. So what I think, if we follow the case of what happened here in UK. So we see that there is no need in sophisticated tools like crowdsourcing platforms or dedicated platforms that you need to understand how it works, because most of this hyper-local mutual aid facilitation take place on a very local level based on WhatsApp or Facebook. And when I follow these groups, and I assume that some of you are also member of this type of groups as well, you can see a lot of messages from people that are not really young, I would say. And these are really people that are considered as a vulnerable population and people in need. And it seems that this simplicity of these tools, and WhatsApp and Facebook are relatively simple to use in comparison to dedicated platforms that are developed in order to address these issues. So this simplicity of these tools really allow this type of communities, members of communities in this type of population to actually be part and to manifest their needs. And this is something which is different from what happened in Russia around HealthMap, because what I remember in 2010, so we had a coordination center with a number of moderators that were receiving calls from villages, and then they were actually putting the messages on the map, and then people in Moscow who have the resources, they were able actually to use the map in order to address these needs. But those who were in need, the vulnerable communities in the case of HealthMap, were not really able to access the map because of the lack of enough technological knowledge, or also because they're in affected areas with limited access to internet. So here again, I would say that this kind of what we can see around hyperlocal organization in UK really allows vulnerable population to be included in a very significant scale. Sam, you are muted. So
Oh, sorry. Another one of our own. Up next is Gulnaz Sharafudinova from Lockdown in Washington.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I showed myself just to say hi, to see you guys. Grisha, so I have a question. You mentioned about digital innovation.
Yeah.
Now, what can you say about who is first in innovating? Do we have a specific pattern in response to crisis that emerges with innovation from grassroots and then is captured by the state? Or I mean, maybe there isn't such pattern, or maybe the pattern that existed earlier is changing now, given that the state is acquiring an understanding of how important it is. So, I mean, do you have any sense of a potential, is it a game of catch up from the state side, or there isn't such thing? I mean, I've noticed that, at least with regard to some of our observations earlier, with regard to, say, the Rosyama, the state the government is trying to co-opt certain measures, right, and is responsive. Is it changing? Would you agree that there is such pattern, that there is grassroots something going on, or maybe that has changed?
Yeah, I think, thank you. It's a very interesting question. And indeed, I think that it has changed, because what we could see around the Russian wildfires 10 years ago, that the digital users and the bottom-up innovation was the first to address the crisis, because the traditional institutions had no enough technical capabilities to address the crisis through technological development. The current situation is very different for a number of reasons. In many states, we can see that actually some of the people, and that's actually a part of the response also to the question that was stated by Patrick Meyer, that some of the people that were participating in all these bottom-up initiatives globally, they moved to work for a lot of different type of international organizations or state institutions. So many states realized, following what happened about 10 years ago, the need to develop capacity to innovate in response to crisis situations. So that's the first thing. Second, we also can see that in Russia, that on the one hand, the state developed much better capacity to have some kind of technological response, but this response is mostly concerned with the control and not participation, because the political mentality and political mindset is not about development of technologies that allow synergy between people and state, but mostly about controlling the people. So we see a lot of different technologies related to face recognition and QR codes and how to control the movement of population. We can see much less technologies about engagement of people, because the platform Мы Вместе that was launched now is just the same as the platform Доброволец.rf that was launched 10 years ago. There is no a big difference. So I would say that there is a better technological capacity on the state side in Russia. At the same time, it seems that to some extent the Russian civil society is a little bit disempowered, and it's not the same society that we could see 10 years ago that was much stronger from the point of view of self-mobilization. So I think that the balance in innovation shifted toward the state, and the capacity of the people to innovate is slightly weaker, and that's why the state is kind of leading. But it's really, we need also to follow the developments and see this balance of power around innovation, who is stronger.
Great. Up next, Svetlana Stevenson from London Metropolitan University. Svetlana, you there?
Sorry. Yeah. So hi. Yeah. So my question is: did the state try in any way to go after these activists, or subject them to some attempts to discredit them, or use state-sponsored trolls on social networks, or did it simply try to create some parallel volunteer structures? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think what we could see around wildfires, that there was a lot of tension between state-sponsored volunteers and the independent volunteers, and there was a lot of kind of efforts to discredit and also to argue that actually the independent volunteers do it only for PR, and they are not professional, and they're just looking for some kind of publicity to become celebrity. And they use the crisis just for their own PR purposes. So that's a very common argument. At the same time, the independent volunteers argued the state is not professional and the state is also not really efficient and they just lying. So there was a clash of discourses and there was no collaboration because the volunteers, the independent one, were arguing that the state is not effective and they are lying, and the state was arguing that the volunteers are not professional and they just want to discredit the state and they just want to get some publicity. Nowadays, it seems, at least from what I can see, and we have a very limited amount of data also because the speed of the development of crisis in Russia is slightly slower in comparison to what happens in UK, in other countries. It seems that the scale of self-mobilization of people in response to crisis is relatively limited. And also there are a lot of state-sponsored initiatives, including some hackathons that kind of invite people to participate in state-sponsored aspects. So the state tries to harness this independent technological capacity as a part of the sponsored initiatives. So I would say, and also because of the very strict limitations generally on population now in Moscow, it seems that there are very limited flexibility of people to participate in any type of self-organization, because here in UK, one of the messages that you are allowed to go outside if you're helping to some kind of vulnerable populations. So that provides some kind of freedom and flexibility to participate in hyper-local initiatives. In Russia, I haven't seen any messages that allow people who participate in this type of initiatives to go outside following the current restrictions. So we will see to what extent the new restriction will be used again in order to restrict some kind of unofficial efforts of volunteers.
Great. Okay, up next, I'm going to read a question from Joanna Shostak at the University of Glasgow. Question is this: does the use of technologies, which you talked about, both the horizontal and the vertical technologies, during the current crisis vary much by region? All right, so are there hotspots or black spots for community organizing in Russia on a regional basis? And she thanks you for a really interesting talk.
Yeah, let me just, I'm just open the question just to make sure that I understand it right, that the use of technologies which you talk about okay, so again, I think that generally, even during the wildfires, we could see that the kind of the big cities were much more active, which is generally a trend that you can see a lot of around different type of political and social activism. Though when we had, for instance, floods in Kubansk, in the Krimsk area in South Kuban in 2012. So you could see also a lot of volunteer initiatives in the Krasnodar area, for instance. I think at this point of time, it's very difficult to judge about what's going on at the regional level in Russia. I think, again, there are very limited amount of information, and also the scope of crisis at this point of time is quite limited in comparison to what we see here. It will be very interesting to follow it, but at the same time, I think that I don't have enough data to address this question at the current point of time.
So interestingly, Sergei Samoilenko, who was asking a question earlier, posted a comment specifically about the floods in Krimsk, which you just mentioned, right? And the lengths that government went to sort of discredit volunteering in that case, again, something that you've written about. If you had to look at sort of lessons learned by the Russian state, both from the fires and then from Krimsk and from other incidents, and maybe even looking globally at these sorts of things. Do you think that, and what lessons do you think that the state takes, and how do those translate into how it's handling something like COVID-19?
So first of all, I think that the Russian authorities developed much better capacity to innovate and to develop some technologies, and also to be quite flexible, because, for instance, I think that opening a Telegram channel in order to inform about crisis, despite the fact that Telegram is not really the most official technology in Russia. This is a kind of shows some degree of openness. We also could see that some authorities, particularly the Moscow government, had a lot of different type of innovative initiatives and experiments around urban activism in a very vertical way when they control all the engagement, but still they had 10 years to experiment with this. And we see that they now try to implement some of the lessons, and what is mostly important, that they have the right technological resources and developers in order to address this crisis. So we can see that unlike in 2010, when the state was not really able to offer any innovative solutions. Now they have the resources, and there are some other organizations like ASIA, Агентство стратегических инноваций, that try to facilitate some innovation as well. So the state is trying to develop some kind of innovative solutions, though these solutions are not really transparent, kind of restrictive, and obviously they don't really support bottom-up mobilization. What is also important that still there is some kind of political mindset that the people are mostly approached as the object of control and not as the subjects to collaborate with. Because here in UK, you can see the multi-level system when you have the bottom-up or horizontal collaboration or local level, and then you can also have some kind of additional synergy with the vertical institutions. In Russia, it seems that there is no any acceptance from the state point of view in regard to supporting this type of bottom-up initiatives. There is no recognition that you cannot address all the problems only through this type of vertical projects. So I think that the political mindset in Russia is still driven that, first of all, you need to develop a very significant scale of control, and it's less about collaboration. And also, again, what you can see about the development of technologies for control that's related to face recognition, etc. This is really interesting because this situation is really used as a case study, as experiment, because these technologies were never used to that scale. Now the state has almost freedom to experiment and to use these technologies because the crisis justifies any kind of use of technology for the sake of addressing the crisis. The problem is that after the crisis will end, these technologies will stay, and that will kind of lead us to a very different type of reality, which can be kind of creepy to some extent.
Well, that leads us very nicely into the topic for next week, when we will be back here in the same place, I suppose, certainly at the same time and in the same format with Marlon Laruelle and Madeleine McCann, both from the George Washington University, who have done an initial sort of tour of research trying to understand what the impact of this crisis may be on regimes and political systems throughout the post-Soviet space. This crisis has the potential both to weaken them in terms of their connections to their societies, but also to give them extra tools and a chance to experiment with some of those tools. Again, both things that you've just mentioned. So we will certainly keep that in mind over the next 7 days or so, and I hope to see all of you back one way or another when we reconvene next week. The last question from Gulnaz: will there be a recording of this? Yes, there is a recording. It should be available to you all through a message in the group chat once this wraps up, and then we will look into ways that we might share it institutionally via social media as well for those who'd like to follow up on some of these thoughts. So please join me in a virtual round of applause for Grisha, and thank you to all of you for joining us, and hope to see you soon. Be well, be safe, be sane, and be happy.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention.